Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. It's the plan so exciting you just can't keep your friends from hearing about it. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/dark. That's mintmobile.com/dark. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/dark. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower than 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening! You're listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark. Welcome, dear listeners, to Season 15, Episode 18. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and in this episode, I'll be performing 4 tales to terrify you, courtesy of authors Finn McCool, Dale Thompson, Seth Paul, and James Colton. Tonight, we'll hear stories of dangerous dimensions, scary surgeons, perilous patients, and terrorizing tomes. You're listening to the standard edition of tonight's program, which contains the first 2 spine-tingling stories. If you'd like to show your support and enjoy an extended version of this and other episodes with twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today. Thank you for your support. Now it's time to take a walk together down the moonlit trail. So lock your doors, turn your lights down low, and settle in. The show is about to begin. People are always trying to tinker, to fiddle with things, either beyond their understanding or unthinkable by any rational person. Sometimes the results are a stunning success, and we lavish praise on such a genius. But sometimes things don't go so well at all. Tonight's stories are about people whose skills and discoveries take them on a wrong turn to places we'd rather not visit. In our first story of the evening, Finn McCool brings us the sordid story of a government experiment that you just know is going to go swimmingly. You have a strange portal, a few test subjects, and a whole world just waiting to see what comes through. It's exactly the kind of thing you expect from people who have an unlimited supply of resources and a dwindling supply of morals. Without further ado, I present to you the investigation of Anomaly 217. The following extract is taken from the personal journal of Alexander Conley, formerly of Washington, D.C. and recently deceased. Mr. Conley was an accomplished defense attorney and human rights advisor who worked for the Justice Department during the early 90s. The account, shared here, relates to a classified mission in which Mr. Conley was an observer. The U.S. government has never admitted to its involvement in the following incident, which occurred on the 15th of January 2002, and the late Mr. Conley's extraordinary account is perhaps the only surviving record of the incident. With that said, what follows is Mr. Conley's story written in his own words. Without doubt, I've experienced the most extraordinary and terrifying day of my professional career. I'm no warrior, and I don't carry a gun. Nevertheless, I don't consider myself a coward. I've faced down many notable opponents in both the courtroom and the political sphere, and I've visited many dangerous parts of the world, often at not inconsiderable personal risk. Nevertheless, nothing in all my years of experience could have adequately prepared me for what I witnessed today. I don't believe I should be writing this. I'm surely breaking multiple federal laws by doing so, even though this account is not meant for public consumption. I've been sternly warned by my superiors that I should not talk to anyone about what I saw under any circumstances. Knowing the Patriot Act as well as I do, I will not take these warnings lightly. The current administration would think little of locking me away in federal prison for the rest of my life, and that's assuming I even made it to a trial. Nevertheless, despite the substantial risk, I feel I must write this account down if only to maintain my own sanity. As this is my private journal, I suspect nobody will ever read this entry, at least not until after my death. I can only hope that the passage of time and scientific advancement will help explain the tragic events I have just witnessed. Where should I begin? I suppose with the whispered rumors that were spreading around D.C. over the last few days. We'd heard talk of a serious incident in Colorado, all very hush-hush and top security. As you can imagine, there's still a lot of fear in the capital at this time as the nation struggles to recover from the 9/11 attacks, and our security apparatus and military fight the opening salvos of the War on Terror. So naturally, we feared there had been a further terrorist attack in the Rockies, possibly involving dreaded WMDs. As the week progressed, it became clear this wasn't the case, as it would have been impossible to keep such an event from the press. Still, there was a lot of excitement in the corridors of power, and it was clear something big was happening out west. But the truth of the matter was above my security clearance level. That's what I assumed, anyway. After all, I was a marginalized and pretty unpopular human rights lawyer in the Justice Department, and certainly not privy to state secrets. That's why I was so surprised to receive the late-night call ordering me to travel to Colorado without delay. I recall feeling a mixture of emotions as I took a quick shower to wake myself up and throw on some clothes and essentials into an overnight bag. I was apprehensive, of course, not least because my superiors had provided the bare minimum of details in the situation, let alone about my role in the events to come. Still, I'll confess to feeling some excitement. I was intrigued and felt privileged to be involved in this covert mission. What can I say? Retrospect is a fine thing. All of my travel arrangements were meticulously arranged. Car arrived at my door only 20 minutes after the call, and I was driven to Dulles International Airport, where I boarded a chartered flight to Denver. From there, I made the last leg of my journey by helicopter, as we flew high up into the mountains and far from civilization and prying eyes. I won't reveal the exact location of the anomaly, as I don't want to be responsible for anyone attempting to visit the site. Suffice it to say, we were deep in the mountains by the time our helicopter descended. The journey had been long, but this gave me ample opportunity to review the briefing file I'd been handed in the car. The limited and heavily redacted papers my superiors provided me with contained little to no information on the incident or the location I was being sped to. There were numerous references to something called Anomaly 217, but no real indication of what this was. Although, by reading between the lines, I could tell this anomaly was of great importance to the federal government. This was, of course, intriguing, but curiously, the bulk of my file consisted of profiles of 2 condemned criminals whose cases I was already familiar with. For legal and moral reasons, I will not write the real names of these 2 high-profile prisoners on these pages, but for the purposes of this narrative, I'll prefer to refer them as Frank and Oscar. Frank was a career criminal with a nasty inclination toward violence against women. He'd been convicted of murdering 3 female co-eds during a home invasion in Tampa and was sentenced to death by a Florida court. Oscar was in a similar situation, having been convicted of shooting a Texas Ranger dead during a botched bank robbery in Austin. Oscar's death penalty had been appealed on multiple occasions, but all his appeals were rejected and the sentence stood. You might wonder what connection these death row prisoners had to the anomaly the government was investigating in the Rockies. Well, that was my question, too, until I reached the end of the file and found 2 waiver forms. I carefully read the legal documents and found they were both nearly identical. One was signed by Frank, and the second by Oscar. In a nutshell, both prisoners had volunteered to participate in an unspecified government operation. In doing so, they effectively signed away their civil rights, accepting they could face serious injury or death as a result of their unidentified mission. Why would anyone volunteer for such a thing? You might well ask. And the answer's simple. Both men had been promised full presidential pardons if they completed their assigned tasks and survived. A cold chill ran through me as I read these details during my flight. I'd heard rumors of condemned prisoners being signed up for secret government experiments. I never truly believed this was possible, but now the evidence was right in front of my very eyes. I'd covered capital trials during my career and was familiar with the cases in question, so I imagined this was why they'd called me in. I saw it as my duty to try to keep this situation under control, but I still had little idea of what I was walking into. I only discovered the horrifying truth once we reached the cave. Our landing was rough as the chopper pilot fought against heavy winds while he attempted to land upon a makeshift helipad. I had nightmarish images of us crashing into the side of the mountain. My career and life ended in a tragic accident, and thankfully the skilled pilot made landfall. The biting cold wind hit me as soon as I exited the helicopter, but I was soon met by a middle-aged woman with brunette hair wearing a neat and professional business suit. Her hazelnut eyes contained a spark as she greeted me with a firm handshake and a half-smile, but I couldn't help but notice how exhausted she appeared, with her face drawn and bags evident under her eyes. She was amicable and courteous, however, shouting out to be heard over the heavy din of the rotor blades. "Mr. Conley, it's a pleasure. My name is Dr. Judith Stein. I work with the research team. I'm here to escort you to the Anomaly site." I adhered to the necessary social niceties as we moved away from the helipad and toward the sprawling military camp of tents and vehicles that had been hastily assembled beneath the mountain. I looked upon the encampment in astonishment, noting how tight the security was at this remote location. There must have been an entire company of heavily armed soldiers maintaining the perimeter as researchers and other government officials went about their business. I was shot suspicious looks by several soldiers, but they all seemed to recognize Dr. Stein, and so we were allowed to pass through unchallenged. At That's a lot of firepower, I whispered to my guide. Yeah, tell me about it, Judith replied, with a tone of irritation. The military is officially in charge of this operation, despite our objections. The commander here is General Stone. I've got to warn you, he's a real hard-ass. I shook my head as I tried to take it all in. I don't understand. Why are they even here? What's this anomaly you're referring to? There was no description in my briefing. Dr. Stein delayed for a long time before replying. We continued walking through the camp, and the researcher made sure we were out of earshot before she finally answered. I'm not surprised I didn't brief you, she said. The White House is keeping the circle as tight as possible. There are those who didn't want you here, Mr. Conley, but some of us are very concerned about the welfare of the two prisoners. They may be murderers, but it doesn't sit right with me. As for the anomaly, well, I think it's better you see it for yourself. I was frustrated by the lack of information, but realized I'd get nothing more from the evasive Dr. Stein. Nevertheless, I followed her through the camp and to the foot of the vast mountain, and that's when we entered the cave and descended into the guts of the earth. The narrow cave entrance was predictably guarded by a squad of armed troops who insisted on seeing my ID card and credentials, despite Judith's reassurances. Electric lamps powered by portable generators lit our path down the long and narrow tunnel. I'll confess to feeling anxious and rather claustrophobic as we went further underground, but thankfully Dr. Stein was there to reassure and guide me. The anomaly was discovered by a caver, she explained as we descended. It might have gone undetected otherwise. There's no record of this cave being previously explored or surveyed, so we've no way of knowing how long the anomaly's been in place. We also don't know how it was created, and specifically whether it's a natural occurrence or purposely made by an intelligent entity or civilization. I have my theories, however. She shot me a sly wink underneath the artificial light, but her words had brought me a little comfort. There were a lot of unanswered questions in my head, but my anxiety was replaced by awestruck wonder once we reached the end of the long tunnel and entered a vast underground chamber. Under stalactites and set against the back wall of the chamber was a thing of beauty. A 10 by 6 foot stationary pool of liquid appearing like a body of water, but without a single blemish on the surface. The liquid membrane was contained behind a security cordon, protected as if it was something precious and of vital importance. I was mesmerized by the sight of the dark liquid membrane, awestruck, but also terrified, as all my years and education could never have prepared me for a sight like this. Anomaly 217, said Judith as she walked up beside me. It's quite something, isn't it? I struggled to find the words, eventually stuttering my next question. What the hell is it? I asked. A trans-dimensional rift, Judith confirmed, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Simply put, what you see is a portal to another world. My jaw dropped in disbelief as I stared at Judith and then backward toward the membrane, wondering if this was all some kind of elaborate hoax. But how could this be? 1,000 questions were in my head, and I wanted to get all the information I could from Dr. Stein, but I never got the chance. I'd been so transfixed by the anomaly that I'd hardly noticed the command station set up at the far end of the chamber, with monitors, computer stations, and an array of cameras set up and powered by yet more generators. A small team of technicians operated the machines, closely watched by yet another squad of troops armed with rifles and submachine guns. But the gray-haired man who marched forward to confront us was no mere foot soldier. He wore the dress uniform of a senior officer with 3 stars on the shoulders of his jacket. The man, who I assumed was General Stone, approached us with a thunderous look in his dark eyes, his face screwed up in rage and his body language hostile, as he shouted angrily at me. So, You must be the bleeding heart loyal those clowns in D.C. sent to interfere with my operation," he said in an accusatory tone, which both shocked and confused me. My jaw dropped as I found myself unable to speak. Luckily, Judith was able to answer on my behalf. "Please, General, Mr. Collins is here at our invitation. He hasn't even been fully briefed yet." The General scoffed and rolled his eyes. "I didn't want him here," he exclaimed. "You people insisted on it and went crying to the White House, but this is still my command." He paused briefly, looking over his shoulder before continuing. "Ah, here come our volunteers now." We looked over Stone's shoulder to see two men in orange jumpsuits being escorted by a team of 4 armed soldiers. I looked at their faces and recognized them both from their mugshots, Frank and Oscar, the 2 condemned prisoners from my file. I watched the pair with some apprehension. Both were undoubtedly dangerous, although they were heavily guarded as the soldiers force-marched them through the underground chamber. Frank looked like a nasty piece of work. He leered suggestively at Judith from a distance, making her feel uncomfortable. Oscar, on the other hand, looked straight ahead with a steely determination visible in his dark eyes. "What do you plan to do with them?" I asked nervously. The General shot me a cruel smirk before answering. "We're going to send them through the portal," he confirmed. I was once again shocked, looking to Judith for some reassurance, but finding that she couldn't meet my eye. "We sent a robot through," she added. "The same design as the Mars rover. We got about 5 minutes worth of data and camera footage before the feed was cut off. Bottom line is we need eyes and ears on the other side. This was too great an opportunity to miss." She didn't sound fully convinced, as I could hear a hint of guilt in her voice. "Is it safe over there?" I asked nervously. Judith nodded her head before replying, although she still wouldn't look me in the eye. "The data we received from the rover confirms that the air is breathable and the temperature stable. The soil samples came back clear and we haven't detected any significant background radiation. That said, we know very little about the environment and whatever inhabits this new world." I didn't like the sound of that last sentence and reckoned these men were being sent on a suicide mission. They were convicted murderers and had no doubt agreed to this dangerous job to get off death row. Nevertheless, this still didn't sit right with me. "These men still have rights enshrined in law and our Constitution," I said firmly. The General's response was mocking laughter. "Listen, you liberal freak," he shouted, whilst pointing his finger in my face. "This is a military operation. I don't have to take this crap. In case you haven't noticed, the world's changed. The gloves are off." I was temporarily taken aback by the General's angry outburst, but wasn't willing to back down. "The fact that I'm here suggests that somebody cares about the welfare of these men," I continued, "and they've been granted the promise of a presidential pardon in return for their cooperation." Stone scoffed dismissively. "Sure, they'll get their pardons, if they make it back." I shot the General a hard look, but was met with only a cold and unrelenting glare. I thought it might actually come to physical blows, but Judith intervened, placing a firm hand on my shoulder as she spoke directly to Stone. "Now, General, we've agreed that the mission will be aborted and the prisoners brought back at the first sign of danger." Stone nodded his head, breaking off eye contact, as he muttered his reply. "Sure, that's the plan," the General said. I was far from convinced, but felt powerless as events moved quickly. Frank and Oscar were kitted out with body armor, helmets with cameras attached, and tasers for their protection, since the General did not trust them with firearms. With these preparations completed, the prisoners were ushered forward at gunpoint. Frank appeared nervous as he approached the dark membrane, but Oscar retained his cool composure. We all watched on in awe as the pair slowly marched toward the Anomaly. I don't think anyone knew what exactly to expect. For all I knew, both men might have dissolved into ash as soon as they touched the membrane, but this didn't happen. Instead, they passed through without incident. Oscar first and Frank next. The two men broke through the liquid-like surface and left our world, turning from condemned prisoners to brave pioneers in an instant. Once the men had passed over, we all gathered around the monitors set up at the rear of the chamber and watched the live feed from the other side. The men moved slowly and carefully through a rocky crevice, looking up at the blood-red sky above them. I could hear Frank breathing heavily through the microphone attached to his helmet. Oscar appeared to be breathing normally, but I noticed how he was scanning the perimeter and the ledges above him, as if searching for threats. We all got the shock of our lives when we saw a flock of bat-like winged creatures flying just above the heads of the prisoners, screeching as they soared upward and perched upon the ledges at the top of the crevice. Frank screamed in panic, while Oscar drew his taser, but the creatures didn't attack. "Amazing," Judah said in awe. "Our first glimpse of alien life." Meanwhile, Stone shouted down the microphone to communicate with the prisoners. "They pose no threat. Keep moving." Soon after, they came across the remains of the robotic rover, all smashed up to hell in the rocks. "Oh my God," I exclaimed in genuine shock. "What the hell could have done this?" Nobody attempted to answer my question, although Stone shouted into the microphone once again, saying, "Make sure you pick up the rover on your way back. It's an expensive piece of equipment." The men continued to walk cautiously through the alien environment. All was quiet for a time, but the tension increased the further they advanced into the crevice, and then it happened. We saw movement in the corner of the screen as something big but fast climbed across the rocky cliffside. Both men turned in that direction and came face to face with a monstrous being. The creature looked like a giant lizard, except its scaly hide was brownish-red color. It must have been 8 or 9 feet long from tail to snout, and its maw looked more like a beak, although when it grimaced you could see its sharp teeth. And all 4 of its legs were adorned with long claws, which could surely rip a human body to shreds. Its reptilian eyes blinked, its pupils dilating, as it focused upon the two men. Frank screamed once again as he pulled out his taser and held it in his shaking hands. The creature must have viewed him as a threat, however, as it screeched loudly and moved rapidly, slinking down the side of the crevice before leaping upon its victim. Frank's camera feed shut down as he was knocked off his feet, but we could still hear his blood-curdling screams through the microphone as the monster tore into his flesh. We caught a quick glimpse of the bloody killing through Oscar's camera, but the second prisoner didn't attempt to intervene, instead turning and fleeing in the opposite direction. "God damn it!" the general screamed. "Who the hell told him to retreat?" "Are you crazy?" I shot back. "That monster's going to butcher him." What we witnessed over the next few moments was a frantic dash, caught through Oscar's camera as he sprinted back down the crevice, jumping over rocks and panting heavily as he occasionally glanced over his shoulder. The creature was soon done with Frank, fresh blood still pouring from its maw, as it tore down the crevice after its next victim. But Oscar was fast and seemingly determined not to die in this hellscape. He made good time, passing the bust-up rover and disturbing the bats, which took flight when they heard the Alpha Predator's high-pitched screech. It was at this point that something became obvious to every person in the command station, although it was left up to Judith to vocalize the imminent threat. "Oh, God!" she exclaimed. "He's leading the monster right back to the portal." "Jesus H. Christ," Stone swore, as I saw fear in his eyes for the first time. "Security team, set up a defensive perimeter around the anomaly. Now! Lethal force is authorized." The soldiers obeyed their orders, running forward and raising their weapons. A tension-filled moment passed, then all hell broke loose. Somehow, Oscar made it back through the portal, panting heavily as he dove through the membrane and held his hands up defensively once he saw the guns pointed at him. "Shoot him!" Stone ordered. but his men never got the chance. The bats came just seconds later, dozens of them flying through the portal and attacking in every direction. Oscar threw himself down to the ground as the soldiers opened fire upon the winged predators. They shot down many, but the surviving bats broke through the cordon, descending upon the screaming troops and tearing at their flesh, eyes, and throats. A massacre ensued as order broke down. General Stone was yelling down his two-way radio, desperately requesting reinforcements from the surface, but there was no way they'd arrive in time. The bats went for Judith next, grabbing at her clothes, hair, and skin. The doctor screamed and looked desperately at me as the monsters physically pulled her up in the air. I threw out my hand in an attempt to save the woman, but their pull was too great, and within seconds, the still screaming Judith was dragged toward the anomaly and through the portal. The giant lizard was next to enter our world, its yellow eyes darting across the blood-soaked cavern as if it were searching for a specific target, and I could only watch on in horror as the creature sped across the chamber and headed straight toward General Stone. The officer had survived the initial massacre unscathed, but was paralyzed by shock as he witnessed the massacre of his men. The lizard's assault brought him back to reality, however, as he drew his pistol and fired. He only managed a single shot that missed his target. Then the beast leapt upon him, knocking the general to the ground and biting deeply into his shoulder. The still-living general screamed in agony and terror as the beast dragged him back across the cave floor and through the portal. As soon as the monster and his victim passed through the membrane, the anomaly faded and then disappeared in front of my very eyes. I didn't understand it, but could only assume that whatever purpose the portal had been created for had now been fulfilled. A moment later, the troops arrived from the surface, charging down the tunnel and finding a horrendous scene, with dead and wounded soldiers and technicians spread across the blood-spattered cave floor. As for me, I was physically unharmed, but knew I'd be mentally scarred for life by what I'd just seen. There followed an intense debrief before I was permitted to fly back to D.C. I guess I was still in a state of shock when a pair of anonymous government agents questioned me, and there was little I could tell them that they couldn't see for themselves in the recordings. I do vividly remember their threats, though. They made it very clear that I must never talk about what I'd seen or heard this day. To the best of my knowledge, only 2 people came out of that cave in one piece. Myself and Oscar. I have no idea whether the government will fulfill its commitment and grant him a pardon. Hell, I don't even know if they'll let me live after all I've learned. Perhaps I'll fall victim to some tragic accident in the coming days or weeks. But, believe it or not, the possibility of my imminent demise isn't what worries me the most. I can't stop thinking about the anomaly, the gateway to another dimension that mysteriously appeared and then disappeared in the space of a few short days. What had created this anomaly? And were Dr. Stein and General Stone purposely taken by those creatures? Are they still alive and being held prisoner in that hellish realm? I don't have answers, but I fear whatever powers inhabit these alternate dimensions are far more dangerous than the terrorists and extremists we face in our world. This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Sharing can be great. You know those videos about cats that your friends are always sending you, or when, look what I can do, videos go painfully, but hilariously sideways, or maybe certain superhero movie trailers you've been waiting to see. Well, it doesn't all have to go one way. Let me tell you something that's so great you won't be able to keep it from your friends. Ready? Get this. Mint Mobile is offering new customers unlimited talk, text, as well as high-speed 5G for just $15 a month. That's right, the kind of things your current wireless service charges you an arm and a leg for can be yours for just $15 a month. Why would you keep this to yourself? Everyone could use a break from overpriced plans that cost you so much and give you back so little. You and your whole group can get all in on this deal, and who knows, maybe they'll start sharing deals on other things with you. Even better, nobody has to rebuild their address book. You can keep all your numbers and your contacts when you make the switch. I think that's something you could all get on in, don't you? Mint Mobile. I say, why wait another day when you can save $15 a month today? I recommend you start with Mint Mobile right now. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/dark. That's mintmobile.com/dark. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/dark. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower, above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. I hope you enjoyed the investigation of Anomaly 217 by Finn McCool, as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Finn-McCool. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/FINN-MCCOOL. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author. I wonder, how does somebody get a job as part of a secret government project? Seems like it'd be a little hard to be a part of all these strange discoveries and weird developments without wanting to just spill the beans to somebody. Of course, maybe there were people that would, but then they got kidnapped by another dimension. Certainly makes that pension less valuable. We now turn to the pen of Dale Thompson, who gives us the story of a doctor in a future where things have gotten a little overwhelming. It's the kind of future that starts with a D, ends with an IAN, and rhymes with dystopian. Yes, it's a little social experiment gone wrong, but our good doctor, despite his underground practice, has methods of dealing with people who do not pay up. Only thing is, sometimes non-payment is the least of your worries. Without further ado, I present to you Keep Them in Stitches. In a dingy back alley lit by dim quivering bulbs, medical malpractice was all the rage. A phrase was coined about the unassuming medical practice by those who knew the streets. Cut 'em up, shoot 'em up, we'll stitch 'em up. One-stop workshop, no questions, no cops. The man who offered such services was considered a rock star among the derelicts who called the area home, sheltered and unsheltered. Needle and thread, stitching, sewing, suturing, mending, patching, repairing. The self-proclaimed physician was known as Doc to all as a practitioner and an artist. Doc was the only medicine man that most of these street people could afford or would put their trust in. Doc ran a completely illegal clinic, bartering and trading rather than demanding drug money. Considerately, he knew these people were at rock bottom, and to deprive them of their daily addictions would be causing them harm. These were unsavory times. This was the only future anyone would ever know. There was always someone easily offended, someone to offend. Right and wrong were yin and yang, two sides of the same coin, and it did not matter which way the coin landed after it was flipped into the air. Everyone lost. The most nefarious person could be called a chameleon. They could change attitudes in a heartbeat and become entirely polite according to the time of day. Despicable, insidious, and incredibly heinous could be in the daylight. Be your mailman, your groceries clerk, or the policeman you greeted every day. These were the days of mistrust where the subversive no longer hid their faces. Absurdity was studied at the universities in order to accept those who were different and to redefine the norm. Books did not need to have an ending, and art no longer needed to be explained. Come one, come all, for all was welcomed, assembled together to create one glowing picture of the state of the world, of the complexation of humanity, a world without limits, without rejection, where all were encouraged to understand their neighbors regardless of how much strain it placed upon one's faculty. Rules still applied, laws were enforced, and justice carried out, but it was a new justice being handed down. It was mire and muck, where Christmas lights were entwined around morass, and anyone could swim in the cesspools as long as the right swimwear was adorned. Dung heaps were built upon the new construction, and cities were raised from fetid depths. Bathos was birthed with fangs and tentacles, ever reaching to expand its territory and to devour all that could not be easily understood, always chomping, viciously masticating with open mouth. From this bedraggled facade, the browns, grays, dull colors of visage bore the weathered resemblance of emaciation, starvation, malnourishment, and impoverished wretchedness. The demeanor became an opportunist, with changeable dispositions so sheer that affability was a put on and kindness was a debt paid. Humanity had been cut deep, and the hemorrhaging was uncontrolled, extravasating, spreading the social and mental contagion inexplicably in an unexplained, unaccountable phenomenon that, when it was taking place, no one could recall any sense of fear. The imminent peril was denied, excused, and dismissed in a way that it was absorbed and sewn into the fabric and tied off tightly. Calamity came, and it never left because people made room for it, blindly sharing everything with dreadfulness. Equality overrode the things set in stone and the upheaval built walls. It did not take long for the rights of the transducer, the interloper, and the trespasser to plant roots and demand retribution. In doing so, the carnage was exalted above all that had welcomed it and received it with open arms in the first place. What ensued afterward was the rise of ignominy, which was re-examined and redefined, reclassified, relabeled, and rebranded. Everything worked together for restructuring, and soon martial law was declared and a police state was established to suppress any rebellion and to quiet the voices of common sense. The law began to chase the shadows, exorcise the demons, vanquish the ghosts, hunt the monsters, and put rewards out for every other unbelievable, imaginary, or non-existent thing. The government divided the people, separated and segregated everyone through a lottery, so that assembling on the wrong day, holding the wrong number, would be punishable by confinement. No one felt safer or better off. Prosperity for everyone, except the rich, dwindled. The city was fed and infused intravenously, and there was no treatment for the incurable malignancy. No official title was given in recognition of the disease. The agencies who wielded the power to name it refused to admit or even acknowledge that it existed in the first place. The reason for this denial was that they were responsible for inventing it and spreading the propaganda associated with it. Unable to control it, inept in their abilities to contain it, they opted to let it burn as an unquenchable fire until there was nothing left to burn. These were the cowards. God hates a coward. The scale of it was global. Everything always becomes worse at night. The dark made this place bad worse during the day. Inside lights were normally extinguished at night and curtains drawn. The only lights anyone was brave enough to use would be in an inner room that had no windows, and then only lanterns and candles were lit. If your light shone, even if a slit or a glimmer of illumination broke free, the hungry would gather. Everyone learned not to let them in because their appetites were insatiable. If by chance, accident, or misfortune opened your door by morning, you would be left scant with meager means at best, and occasionally lives were lost. No bomb was dropped to start this declivity. It was a gradual release of power by the people who put their trust in talking heads, rather than believing in themselves enough to take the reins. Everyone, and I mean everyone, got used to the handouts. Little by little, that which was being given freely produced an obese and indolent workforce that saw no reason to do more than they needed. People stopped going above and beyond. For time, social programs pulled back resources, and people did not even notice, and prices began to skyrocket. Supplies were low and support dried up. The nightmare was happening. The terror arrived unnoticed, and people lived with it, too blind to recognize that hell had come to earth. By the time the word spread, citizens had lost their fight to push back. The doc ran his medical facility in a part of the city where the authorities would not normally enter unless they entered with a small army. This place was very well hidden, tucked away in the convexity of an alleyway that, at first glance, looked like a dead end. Because it appeared not to go through, though, and appeared terribly menacing, the only ones who would trek through the alley were the absolute desperate ones. Insupportable with an obvious exit, it remained safely tucked away, unnoticed by anyone wanting to close it down. On any given night, the doc may have up to 10 patients, some with minor injuries, some with broad maculations from severe beatings, but his real specialty was the deep wounds and lacerations which required needle and thread. Many were leery of the doc, irresolute, because the punishment, if found being treated by him, might have been worse than the actual injury sustained. The doc raised his voice. He was a medium-sized man, late 40s, plenty strong still to work with only one assistant, a nurse he called Angel. That wasn't her real name, but real names in an illegal trade could get you killed. Still, steady on, man. I cannot stitch you if you're fighting me. The doc had his hands full. He'd received a shotgun victim earlier in the evening who begged for his help. Once the doctor began nibbling at his multiple wounds with tweezers, the man became aggressive. He lurched violently at the doc, but because the man had lost a tremendous amount of blood, a terrible spasm made him shudder, and the shock took him over and weakened him. The problem now was, after most of the pellets had been extracted, the sewing up of the wounds roused him, and the man got his second wind. Eventually, after another injection of muscle relaxer, the doc was back in control and stitched him up really well. One of the drawbacks to the doc's facility was he didn't have beds to keep anyone for any extended period of time. He patched them up and released them under their own strength. What happened to his patients after they were released were none of his concern, unless they owed them. Those forgetting their debts to him would learn rather quickly that the doc was not only a healer but could also be a punisher as well. He believed very much in the Darwinian quote, survival of the fittest. The doc would choose a day when he would collect from debtors, or as he would call them, deadbeats. He was not afraid to pay these delinquents a visit. In this dystopian era, it was a dog-eat-dog world. And because of the desperation that the oppressed were under, one might kill even a friend to live to see another day. The doc, however, did not live by this principle. He was not concerned about his survival because he was well off. He had no real needs. His belief in ethical living meant he had to live according to his standard, not one out of fear. He paid his creditors and expected nothing less from those who had called upon his specialized services. On this night, the doc left his practice. He took the tunnels deep under the city where the deviants and the depraved existed. He traveled alone with his black medical kit and held it close to himself, because the underworld was cruel and unforgiving, but not as unforgiving as he was. The Doc knew the subterranean landscape because, as a child, this is where he lived and played. He knew which tunnels led where, which ones to avoid, and every possible shortcut. Tonight, he was on his way to collect from one of the deadbeats. Above him was the city with its controlled chaos. The municipalities wore blinders, and where dirty politics gorged on its citizens and spit the bones out, still kicking with animated death throes, the main powers looked the other way. On top, it was a slaughterhouse, a meat market where flesh was bought and sold. These were the ones who never saw themselves escaping to the underworld below them, but in time, most would find that they had no option. A person was either rich or poor. The poor still held on to the bourgeois illusion. Their revolution had already occurred. They were defeated and still had not realized it. Underground, the deplorable, those who wanted all they could get through any means available, and deranged with mental limitations, physical scars, and selfish pig ethics, scraped up the oily soot and grime and boiled it in their soup to drink. In these invariable anarchic times, the undesirables were outcasts in the city's swollen belly of refugees. Violence and turbulence, calm and peace were utterly irreconcilable. Never would amicability be agreed upon. The Doc soon traversed the many blocks with very little antagonism toward him, which was generally the case. If people had even an ounce of intelligence, they would not seek to harm the Doc because one day they, or someone they knew, would possibly need his gifted services. The Doc made an inquiry, and one of the cave dwellers led him to where he wanted to go. Alone, he stood before a thin wooden door, which was the entryway to a loosely built shack made of collected and recycled things. He could see beneath the door a light burned inside. He smiled genuinely and knocked on the door, which rattled the shanty. The door opened, and the eyes of the one who greeted him neither showed hospitality nor welcome. As a matter of fact, they filmed over with numbing fear. The Doc stepped in without invitation. "Hello, Roderick. How's the belly wound healing up?" Roderick was a bony adult male whose face wore the expression of more years than he'd been alive, along with the nervousness that defined his entire grave demeanor. "I didn't know you made house calls," Roderick said as he took a step backward, feeling for something out of reach with his right hand. The Doc noticed his flimsy fumbling, and, not being there to play games, he withdrew what appeared to be a handgun from his coat, held it at his waist, aimed it at Roderick, and squeezed the trigger. The dart which the gun had been loaded with was not to murder, but rather to render paralysis. The dart was filled with a relaxant called rocuronium, and it was fast-acting. Roderick stumbled sideways, believing he was mortally wounded. A chill laid a hold of him, but within seconds he could feel nothing. Fully awake, totally aware, Roderick could not resist. The Doc went straight to work while explaining the procedure with him, as Roderick's unblinking eyes stared straight ahead without a twitch. "You know debts must be paid. It is intolerable, completely unavoidable, for one to skip out on a payment. You should have predicted that this day would come. I sent word to you more than once explaining that I was a patient man, but I performed a service for you, a service that saved your miserable life. And what did I get in return? Nothing. Not a thing. Because you're a delinquent and far past due, it was necessary for me to pay you a personal visit." Roderick wanted to scream, to yell for help, but his throat was closed as the Doc rummaged through his black bag, pulling out a needle and thread. "Feeling less vindictive today, thus I will permit you to keep your eyeballs, but I am forced to seal your eyes shut." With ease, the Doc took his threaded needle and began to suture both Roderick's eyes closed by pulling the top lid down and attaching it right above the eyelash to the bottom lid. When you remove these later on, you'll need to be very careful as to not damage the glands and muscles in the process. I debated on removing your tongue surgically, professionally, After consideration, I've decided to permit you to keep your tongue so you can spread the word. If anyone owes me or has not paid me, I'm coming for them. I cannot promise that every job will be as neatly done as this one." The doc finished up, packed his instruments and tools, and exited. He couldn't wait to get out of this putrefying place of illicit drug use, amputees, and criminally insane. The following day, the doc was awakened by Angel, who always arrived on time to work at noon. The real action of the city didn't normally begin to produce its mutilations, abuse, attacks, murders, and drug overdoses until right around 3 in the afternoon. At least the reprobates got to sleep in late. Even among the rich, they suffered their fair share of mayhem. The rich were widely covered through their businesses and employment. They could visit the hospitals where they could receive the best care. That being said, as a fact, it did not rule out the rich becoming involved in contemptible acts and behavior that would bring harm to them either. If the offense of one of the rich were to be unconscionable or, say, abhorrent, they would most likely avoid the general hospitals and fear the authorities questioning them extensively and possibly filing charges against them. Seeking treatment in the general hospital for such things as gun or knife wounds would not be the smartest thing to do. This is where the doc's specialized treatment would be used, and no one would be the wiser. It was best in those instances to avoid hospitals altogether and throw themselves upon the mercy of the doc. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, an urgent banging of the doc's fortified door was heard. Angel answered it to find a man bleeding, leaning heavily upon the shoulder of another man who did not appear to be injured. Angel called for the doc and showed the 2 men straight to the theater. The injured man was sat upon the table, unable to sit on his own, leaned to one side and laid down with agonal moans of intolerable pain. When the doc entered, he recognized the man right away. The man was Addison Simpson, a doctor of divinity who taught at one of the religious institutes of higher learning. He was also a man who promoted and practiced chattel slavery as well, an abominable practice that had come back into favor with the rich. These Methodists, along with the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, saw nothing immoral with reinstituting slavery upon the poor and dragging their children into bondage as well, calling it an indispensable consequence. The doc called this type of practice a journey through hell. He despised these inhumane, pious hypocrites. Although he held the highest disdain for these types of men, his duty as a physician, one who heals and treats the sick, was his first priority. With his indignance for the man hidden away and masked, he began to examine the clergy and found him to be in very bad shape. The doctor never needed, wanted, or expected details, but he did have to ask certain questions just to make sure he was treating the wounds properly. The clergy was stained with so much blood it was difficult to know how many individual wounds he'd suffered. The doc looked first for any which could be fatal, if not immediately treated. He spoke to the man to get the dealings and matters of compensation resolved before he went to work. "Reverend, I'm here to treat you to the best of my professional ability, but you do realize that my services are not charitable. This is a reparation involved." The clergy gave the doc a stern scowl and said, "God owes no man anything. I am a god in his service. If you are treating me, you are treating God." He winced in indescribable pain. The doc realized that with each drop of lost blood, as it dripped and plopped onto the floor, the clergy was bleeding out hurt vanity. Instead of becoming irate or perturbed, the doc inquired further. "Of course, Reverend, it is understood, yet I cannot imagine God, the supreme deity of the universe, being injured on our streets." This infuriated the clergy. He ground his teeth together and was ready to give the doc the severe castigation of a lifetime when the pain arrested his vitality. It caused him to expend the last of his defiant energies, and he passed out. The man that was with the clergy, who was obviously a slave, asked, "Has he died?" Angel replied, "No, but would that be such a bad thing?" "Listen, man, what are the nature of these wounds?" the doc asked the manslave. Hesitantly, the manslave answered, "These wounds are not from man, they are from monsters. These are claw marks from the grave." The doc and Angel had heard it all before, they thought, but this was the first monster attack anyone had claimed. Monster attack? Do you mean like a cryptid Lovecraft creature from space? The doc tried not to laugh. "No, I'm speaking of the quizzical incorporeal, the indeterminate evil ones with mirth and mockery." The eyes of the manslave widened in nervous excitement. "What was the instrument used to inflict these gashes? Some of these injuries look deep." The doc asked as he and Angel began to disinfect the wounds. The manslave spoke exasperatedly as if he was reliving the frightful event. Laughing and jeering apparitions, unexpected, undreamed, attacked him as he was delivering a sermon. "With all certitude, I do not lie," the manservant answered. "Knives? Swords? Axes? What caused these injuries?" the doc firmly demanded to know. "It was the great sorrow with the talons of an eagle and claws like a bear. They thrashed him before he could be rescued from their clutches," the manservant answered, gloomed with woe. "I've never heard of anything so ridiculous in all my born days," the doc said, deciding to ignore the manservant who seemed him uneducated and imbecilic. The doc and Angel worked to save the clergyman's life. After cleaning and disinfecting the wound, dozens or so, he sutured each, opening and closed, in hope. Well, there was no internal bleeding, as much as he could tell, although 2 of the stab wounds were penetratingly deep. A single major organ or blood vessel was cut. The doc stepped outside as the patient rested, outside into the gritty air which left a greasy residue upon everything. The manservant followed him into the evening. "Will he live?" The doc turned to the manservant and diagnosed. "Live tonight, yes. Those wounds will need to have the dressing changed regularly. I have shot him full of antibiotics to prevent infection, but I cannot make any promises." "Doc, I was there. I witnessed the attack. Reverend Simpson is ascetic. His entire life has been devoted to the Word of God. No one expected such impending doom to be unleashed upon him. That which assaulted him had no face. It was unseen. The sanctuary became thick with a mist and heavy oppression before the violence occurred. It was marred and mangled before any of us had time to react. It was an invisible force, maybe a demon or some other evil entity, but no one man or any men did this to him." The doc could not believe this report. The account seemed indeterminate, as if there were gaps missing from the narrative. He was not interested in the vague. He needed details. Something to him was just not sitting right. There were no more patients that particular evening, and although the doc worked all hours, when he sent Angel home, he usually put his feet up. On this night, he had to tend to his patient, the clergyman. Eventually, when the drugs began to wear off, Reverend Simpson opened his eyes and spoke. "Where am I?" His memory was still fogged over due to the medicines he had been given. The doc helped him into a sitting position, gave him a drink of water, and asked, "Do you remember what happened to you?" "I saw specters dancing before my eyes. They were like tiny stars. They were so tiny you could have put 1,000 of them on the tip of a needle. At first I thought, oh, how quaint, how marvelous, but then I fear, in all of its horror, as these minuscule specks of light formed together as one, I was shocked into insensibility, and then came this stupendous and awful assault. How something so brilliantly magical could change so quickly and unleash atrocious cruelties in that manner escapes my logic. It was a devastating decompaction of my soul. There's nothing I could do to shield myself, fight back, or flee. The doc listened sympathetically, yet with grand skepticism as well. If the clergy did not want to admit the truth of the matter, that was totally on him. The truth was not as important as the payment he expected. Unlike you, Reverend, I do not use my craft out of love. I practice for gain. I saved your life last night. Without me, we would not even be having this conversation. I would suggest that you think of something that you have that I might be interested in that will settle our debt. The doc reminded the clergy of his obligation for services rendered. The clergy stumbled with his words, and the doc interrupted him. Save the preamble, not interested. I do not need excuses. I need to know now what I should expect to receive for your life. The clergy dropped his eyes to the floor. From me? You can expect to receive no monetary reward for saving a man of God. I say I will not report your illegal operation here to the authorities, and you can remain working, and we are, even. The clergy answered agitatedly. Rev, you do not seem to understand. Here, in this part of the city, no one gets anything for free. I know you must have connections, and there are certain things that I require for my practice, which I am sure you could provide for me, the doc growled. The clergyman replied with a sneer and shook his head in disbelief at the doc. Kilroy, collect my belongings. We're leaving, the clergyman called to his manslave. The doc did not argue further, nor did he attempt to prevent them from leaving. Remember, Rev, if unseen hands can do that much damage to you, just imagine what trained physical hands can do. I do not take kindly to threats, the clergy warned, as he stood with the help of Kilroy, his manslave. I could bring abolition down on this place with a snap of my finger, the clergy announced. You know what I do not appreciate? The doc gave it a dramatic pause before continuing. Then he surmised, deadbeats. The doc said, I'll be seeing you. Doubtful was the last thing the clergy said before Kilroy escorted him out. The doc told Angel when she arrived that the clergyman had made a great error in judgment. He had made an unfavorable impression on him. That's okay, though, Angel. Danger is everywhere, and if the man believes the Bible he preaches, then he should expect to reap what he has sown. The doc was not the type of man to let anything go when he believed an injustice had been served. Will you collect immediately? Angel asked. No, not immediately. We will probably be busy for the next few days. I will preserve the clergy until I have to be out his way. There are a couple on my naughty list that I may have to pay a visit to. I will take care of God's man there. The doc was impregnated with revenge, but he would let it gestate, for all tyranny, social, religious, or otherwise, would have an end. Over the next few days, the clinic was busy with careless criminals needing to be stitched and patched up. Not one of them mentioned anything about invisible monsters thrashing about. The doc had been up to his elbows in blood, but the debt the clergyman owed him stayed near the forefront of his mind. For the doc, unpaid bills were the unforgivable sin. He did not get off bringing calamity to anyone's door, but there was a certain amount of satisfaction, especially when people with influence and power did the unthinkable. He didn't know why he was about to burst into a paroxysm of rage because others had tried to get out of their debt by not paying and hoping that he would forget. None of the former deadbeats made him as angry as did the clergyman. The doc's mind was a steel trap. Anything that was placed in there was never forgotten. The doc put Angel in charge of the clinic. After all, she'd been with him for so long. She was an excellently skilled apprentice, and she knew all of the ins and outs and could suture almost as well as he could. He was determined to get payback from the clergyman and knew right where to find him. The doc took the underground route, avoiding the traffic and polluted air from above, He also avoided rain at all costs. There were dark clouds overhead, darker than the usual dirty gray clouds that hovered, and if it did rain, it would bring all of the uncollected filth overhead straight down on the city. Underground was quieter as well, the street noise, and minus the ceaseless human communication. The doc was soon at his destination with his black medical bag. He came out of the tunnel system 1 block from the church. He'd never been more intent on collecting what was owed to him than right now, in this moment. All looked quiet, which was his cue to approach the church. He found the front door, which was facing a semi-busy street with horn blasts, to be open, so he strolled in as if he owned the place. The church was empty, except for the angels painted on the walls and an image of Christ over the altar, which gave him a feeling of desolation. He was hoping to find the clergy acquiescing and reasonable to his request for payment. He had not been inside a church for ages. He had an irresistible urge to confess his sins and to repent, but he decided to save them since he was most likely going to rack up more sins in the next few minutes. A familiar voice called out to him. "What are you doing in God's house?" It was the clergy, and he looked as though he was making good progress since the surgical procedure had stopped his guts from falling out. The doc said, "I'm looking for God. Looks like I found him." "Find God, servant, and you have found God," he answered, lifting a mocking brow. "You're not blaspheming the house of God." The clergy spoke with some sort of inside voice, with a disconcerting vibrato tone. "I attest, Reverend, that I find you in excellent health, thanks to me." Unabashed, the doc set his medical bag upon a pew and opened it up. "What is this? What do you want?" The doc answered coldly. "I thought this was God's house, a sanctuary for all us trespassers. I'm here for supplications. Have I entered the wrong building?" The doc smiled. He withdrew his dart gun. "What? Are you going to shoot me here, in the house of God?" "I am sure for you this is an aberration, but for me, it is the cost of doing business. Now, let us deal, preacher. What do you have for me?" The Reverend was impaled with a mortal agony mingled with the uncertainty of his dire situation. "Silver and gold I have none, but what I do have I give to you." The doc was not familiar with the Bible text, so he asked, "What is it that you do have?" The clergy looked at him with kind eyes and answered, "Eternal life." The doc squeezed the trigger, and the dart with the paralyzer hit its target, dropping the clergy instantly. The doc walked over to the body, lying awake but rigid. "I already know Jesus, Reverend. You see, you and I were on the same side." The clergy's countenance was in suspended animation, a look of disbelief. "It sickens me to have to do this to a man of the cloth, but I do not know what would have led you to believe that you could get off not paying your debts." The clergy would have replied if his tongue had not become useless in his mouth. The doc removed his needle and threaded it carefully right before the bewildered, fearful eyes of the clergy. He did so slowly, meticulously, so that the clergy could understand the scale of his offense. The doc heard something rustle from behind him, and by the time he turned to see what it was, everything had gone dark for him. The doc did not know how much time had passed. He awoke to a severe headache, which he diagnosed as a severe concussion. He quickly realized a number of things. He'd been foolishly careless. He was no longer in the church. From the sounds of abstract nature, he assumed he was in a blackened stratum outside the city. He had been nowhere close to this in years. He didn't know what was even out this far. His next physical hindrance, other than the stabbing pain in his head, was he realized he was experiencing tarsorrhaphy. He knew the meaning of this word as well as anyone would. His eyes had been sewn closed. No doubt, he thought, thanks to the saintliness of the Reverend Dan Kilroy, his manslave who most likely had smashed him in the head with a crucifix. Talk about God striking a man down. He could not believe it. Once he came to terms with what already seemed like unreasonable circumstances, he realized that the finger on both of his hands had been sutured together in a way that he could not spread his fingers out. As his body was waking, he was slowly being reminded of the severity of his situation. When he realized that his lips had also been sewn together, the horrendous reality came crushing down upon him as to how precarious his predicament truly was. It only became worse for the doc when he heard a maniacal laugh, an eerie cackle that sounded otherworldly. He was being touched, manhandled, and when he reached back, there was no one there. He felt no person, no flesh and bone. He wrestled with the air until he felt the first slice of a talon across his chest, then another, and another. His cries were muffled in his throat as he struggled against unknown entities. He tried to chew through his own lips to unstring the thread, but he was defeated, kept in stitches. I hope you enjoyed Keep Them in Stitches by Dale Thompson, as performed by yours truly. If you enjoyed that tale and would love to read more from tonight's very talented featured author, you can help support him by visiting simplyscarypodcast.com/Dale-Thompson. That's simplyscarypodcast.com/DALE-THOMPSON. Thanks again for your support of this program and tonight's featured author, as well as all of our authors who provided us with stories this evening. Now, before we go, I would also like to take a moment to thank you personally for joining me on this episode of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. If you've enjoyed what you've heard on today's program, please take a moment to stop by our iTunes page or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcast and leave us a 5-star review and a kind word. It makes a huge difference, and it would mean a lot to us. If you'd like to hear a premium extended edition of tonight's and all of our other episodes featuring twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can purchase season passes on this podcast or our other quality storytelling programs, or become a patron for as little as $5 a month and get access to our entire audio archive dating back to 2012, all of it ad-free. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, you can follow and subscribe to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all of our latest updates and new releases and have the chance to interact with each and every one of us every week. You can subscribe to me on YouTube as well at the Otis Jiry channel, where you'll find releases of my series, Horror Storytime, dating back to 2014, 10 years now. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, or X, and Instagram too. Just search for Otis Jiry. Until next week, stay spooky and get some sleep if you can. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast,
check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's OTIS@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.